Okay, good evening everybody. Just moving on to the fourth webinar for the safeguarding set of webinars. This one is about safeguarding adults at risk. So I'll go through the different issues. It's quite a basic policy really, and we'll be reviewing it again at the end of May into early June. And there'll be a little bit more, but the procedures will still be quite basic in relation to adults at risk, because we're not quite there as a society in the way we are with safeguarding children. There's no such thing as adults at risk first or anything like that. Legislation is quite lacking in it, but the HSE are doing quite a lot of work into this, and it's the same in every country, trying to do our best to protect adults at risk, so people who can't really protect themselves. I should say, in relation to questions this time, I have some questions that I'm going to deal with at the end of this webinar. They're in relation to the previous webinars to do with ratios and so on. I'll address them at the end, and also the question facilities available there tonight if you want to type in your questions, and we'll deal with them at the end of this presentation as well. So I'll go straight into the safeguarding adults at risk policy now. So it's one of the four that I've been dealing with. This is the fourth webinar, Safeguarding Adults at Risk. The policy number there is BOD-SG-003. And it's quite a different policy compared to our Safeguarding Children policy. And it's important for everybody to remember with this, and I'm sure a lot of people do, but we do have a tendency, if we're dealing with an adult at risk, to start treating that person like a child sometimes, because we see differences and so on, and that's really important that we don't. We have to try and get away from that. So I'll go through the principles in relation to safeguarding adults at risk. They're quite different from the principles that are in the child safeguarding policy and the code of behaviour. So I'll talk about then adults at risk of harm and what that means. It is someone who's over 18. So it's important to specify that we're talking about people who are 18 years plus. And we talk about assessing and managing the risk of harm to those adults, identifying, responding and reporting to it. There's responding to concerns in regard to Scouting Ireland personnel. It's the same. That's the same as in the child protection policy. And again, managing information and confidentiality is so important. And the code of behaviour goes back to recruitment and selection of Scouting Ireland personnel. And I'll talk a little bit about the provision of information. So you can see the principles are quite different. So because someone's 18 years and over, they have a lot of rights that we don't directly equate with children, although children do have those rights as well, but parents and other adults have a responsibility to, I suppose, protect those rights on behalf of children. And we have that responsibility with adults at risk, but adults at risk have rights to make decisions for themselves where children don't. And some adults, I suppose, because of the seriousness of a mental health or intellectual disability issue, may not have that capacity, and there's law in relation to that. So it's a rights-based approach. So we always have to consider that the adult at risk that we're dealing with, if we want to go reporting it, has rights to decide in relation to what they want to do about something. So to respect those rights, it's all about empowering an adult at risk to make the right decision and help them to make the right decision for themselves. Sometimes we may decide ourselves to report something because the adult at risk maybe is in denial or for some other reason, but we always must go down the road first at seeking their consent to report for them or to try and get them to make a report. It's person-centred, so it's about the adult at risk. It's not about the rest of us. That's a very important thing to remember in safeguarding. It's the same with children. It's about the person that we're dealing with. It's not about the organisation to protect. I've already mentioned that it's consent-driven, that we're dealing with the adult at risk, and sometimes we may go and report something despite them not giving their consent, but in general, we should go looking for the consent and try and talk to that person to gain their consent. And it's collaborative. So it's about working with other agencies, in particular the HSE and the HSE in the Republic of Ireland and the Health and Social Care Trust, the HSC in Northern Ireland. So they're the people that we'll be reporting to in addition to the police. So it's a collaborative approach between a lot of different agencies, which is very similar to Children First in that way, in that respect. So adults at risk of harm. So there's two different slides. I'll just flick forward and then back. We deal with personality characteristics and life circumstances when we talk about adults at risk or adults in need of harm. So if an adult at risk is someone who has certain personal characteristics, they're a person who's 18 years or over, but one of the characteristics might be their age. So it might be someone who's really elderly and not able to look after themselves. I'm not going to specify an age because I might insult somebody who's listening. I don't want to do that because there will be people who are quite old who are well able to look after themselves. So it's just that their age may be a characteristic, and maybe along with other things that makes them an adult at risk. Certain types of disability or all types of disability make an adult at risk of more at risk of harm than other adults. But some types of disability in particular cause that problem, and intellectual disability and mental health is a huge factor in adults who are abused or harmed by other people who should be looking after them. So an illness, and this is one that kind of can be temporary in nature. So an illness or an injury caused to someone could make someone adult at risk. So if someone has an accident and breaks their leg, until they're treated and looked after, they're an adult at risk of harm because they're not able to protect themselves from harm, property, or from serious exploitation. And that could just be a temporary kind of a circumstance or characteristic. So there could be people with special educational needs or an intellectual disability, mental or physical disability or impairment. And again, some of those could be temporary in nature or some of them could be permanent. And when the temporary in nature, obviously the adult is only at risk while that mental or physical disability is prominent or in progress. And I suppose it's covered by all the others, but in some respects it's not. There could be a disturbance in the functioning of the mind or the brain that makes someone an adult at risk of harm. And again, that could be temporary as well. So there's some life circumstances that should be adults at risk of harm as opposed to in need of harm. So there's life circumstances such as someone being very isolated, some socioeconomic factors. There could be people in abject poverty or have poor environment living conditions that make them adults at risk of harm. And it can be often in addition to the personal characteristics earlier on. So there could be an accumulation of different personal characteristics and life circumstances that could make someone an adult at risk of harm. So an adult at risk of harm then could become an adult in need of protection because their personal characteristics and or the life circumstances that I just talked about and an inability to protect their own well-being, property, assets, or their rights or other interests could make them an adult in need of protection. And then the action or inaction of others could cause or likely to cause harm to the adult at risk. So that's kind of where it has become urgent, and maybe we'd be thinking of reporting it to the Gardaí or the PSNI directly because something is imminent that's going to happen to the person. But the important thing here, the important phrase here really for adults at risk of harm is that it's someone who's unable to protect their own well-being, their own property, their assets, or their rights or other interests. So It's not an adult scouter who isn't an adult at risk generally being bullied by another adult scouter that fits for this. This is not the type of report that you make for adults at risk of harm because of some bullying going on. That's a different issue, and that's dealt with under our DRAP procedures, and that's how that's reported. This is for someone who's not able to look after themselves. And I'll be introducing other Irish legislation into the policy the next time. So the definition there would be someone who's not able to protect themselves from harm or serious exploitation by another person. That's the type of person that we're talking about who's an adult at risk of harm or abuse. So you can see from the types of abuse that the 4 types of abuse that we talk about in relation to children are present here. So there's physical abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, sexual abuse and neglect are all types of abuse that can occur for adults at risk of harm or abuse. And then there's a few more. There's financial abuse. So that's someone who maybe you would have heard radio or seen television ads in relation to this over the last year or so that were produced with the support of the HSE. So it could be someone, it could be a family member who does the shopping for an elderly person or a person who has a disability and keeps the change. Or it could be someone who's taking money out of the bank account or cashing the pension and keeping the money from the pension and not looking after the person properly. So that's financial abuse. Financial abuse can lead to neglect because the person who's at risk of abuse doesn't have the means to look after themselves because they don't have any money. Institutional abuse is where the adult who's at risk is actually in an institution. Now it may be a daycare centre that they go to where they get their meals, where they meet other people who have disabilities or other elderly people, and there could be someone in there who's involved in abuse of those people, and it could be financial abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, all of those others, and it could be exploitation. So that's kind of institutional abuse, and obviously it goes into residential places where people with disabilities or older people reside, different types of nursing homes and so on, and hospitals, psychiatric facilities and so on. So there could be abuse going on in there that we find about because we're interacting with these people and we develop concerns that there may be institutional abuse or any other type of abuse going on in relation to the adult at risk. Neglect can be a big issue for people who are at risk, adults. Sometimes it can be self-neglect, and it may be because they're just not able to look after themselves. It could be neglect by people who are supposed to care for them. And then there's exploitation. So exploitation in this case is another adult exploiting the person who's an adult at risk of harm or abuse. And I suppose the examples would be labour exploitation, where they're being used to do work that they're not being paid properly for, or they're not being paid the same as someone who isn't an adult at risk will be paid. There could also be drug exploitation, where local drug dealers are using people with disabilities to hold the drugs for them or even to sell the drugs for them, and are being exploited in relation to that. So what do we do if we have a concern about this? Well, it's very simple. It's the same as children. If you have a concern that there's an adult at risk or an adult in need of protection, contact a safeguarding party, if it's the safeguarding department. And it's safeguarding@scouts.ie, or you ring the main number for Scouting Ireland. If there's an immediate risk, by all means, contact the statutory authorities and let them know. But if you would let us know then that you've done that and give us the details, it's like doing a report for children. You take notes, you record your notes, and you let us know about it. And we're the place to keep all of that information securely in Scouting Ireland, rather than scout leaders, different scouters keeping different bits and pieces of information all over the country. The safeguarding department is the place to store that. So once we report then to the statutory authorities, we'll liaise with them after that in relation to anything that Scouting Ireland can do for them to help them with their investigation or assessment. And that may include getting in touch with the reporter. That's the same for child abuse inquiries as well. It may be the person who reported the safeguarding department that the statutory authorities want to interview, because that's really what kicks off an investigation, is that initial report. So it's really a very basic policy. It's probably what the first child safeguarding or child protection policy was back in the 80s, really, and it's developing more. There's new reports coming out from the HSE in relation to what we need to do for adults at risk. You may see the term in different documents, vulnerable adults. It's changing to adults at risk with all of the different agencies that work with it. I see in a recent report from the HSE, they've changed from vulnerable adults to adults at risk. The legislation might still say vulnerable adults, and you'll see that in the review of this policy as well in relation to Irish legislation, will still refer to adults as risk as vulnerable adults, because it takes a long time to change legislation. But yeah, things are moving in relation to it. There's a lot of organisation involved in it. There's an adult safeguarding network that Scouting Ireland is a member of, or the safeguarding department is a member of, and there's a lot of work being done there for all of the different NGOs, organisations like Scouting Ireland, who do some work with people who are adults at risk. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. I'll just pass over to Jill to see if there are any questions arising out of this presentation, and then I have some other questions to address in relation to the last 3 webinars there that have come up since. There, I'll just pass over to Jill.
Not too many questions this evening. So there was one question there that was asked, can we define what is an adult at risk? And I think, Michael, you answered that as you went on your question. Can we tell people when parents are to become involved in a safeguarding issue? And that would very much depend on what the issue is. But if you're ever unsure, just pick up the phone or send us an email, and we'll either send you in the right direction, or we will take care of whatever issue you're concerned about. I've answered all the other questions, and they're all up there online. So thank you very much for your questions.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks, Jill.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll move on to the other safeguarding questions, and one has just come to mind that I haven't put on the slide, so I'll answer that yet. I'll answer that first. Someone had asked a question about telling the parents about abuse for children, and that's what the safeguarding department do. We make contact with the parents before we go to TUSLA and the Gardaí, and very often we gain a little bit more information that's helpful to TUSLA and the Gardaí. So get on to us straight away if you have any concerns, and we'll deal with the family and the parents. And we may indeed use someone from the local scout group who might know the parents as well. That doesn't happen very often. It depends on the situation. But yeah, make contact with the safeguarding department as soon as you have a concern, and we can take it from there and take that pressure off of you. So other safeguarding questions that came up over the last few weeks that I haven't dealt with yet. A couple of people asked about the charities regulator and child safeguarding statements. And what they were really wondering, I think, was from the questions, is the Scouting Ireland child safeguarding statement okay to put up in a scout den when each group is its own separate charity? Is the group not supposed to develop its own child safeguarding statement? Well, the child safeguarding statement is developed for groups, and it's a generic one that can be used, and the charities regulator accept that. What isn't generic, though, necessarily, is the risk assessment that's done by the group. We have a sample risk assessment, and we try to deal with all of the questions that come up for a risk assessment, but the group has to do its own risk assessment in case there's something specific about that group that needs to be considered as part of the risk assessment that isn't a generic one for all groups. And I mentioned a couple of times over the last few weeks doing the webinars that I'm going to do a webinar on conducting the risk assessment. We're just reviewing our sample risk assessment template at the moment, just to bring it up to date with the new documents, and we'll do a webinar in relation to that to help people conduct that risk assessment, because I know people are kind of afraid that and probably hate doing risk assessments. But they are actually quite easy, like just a simple risk assessment. When you look up and down a road, left and right before you cross the road, that's a risk assessment. And most risk assessments are simply asking a few basic questions. And when it comes to child safeguarding, the risk assessments are, if we do this, is it going to put children at risk of harm? Or if we don't do something, and what do we need to do to protect that? And most of the questions are dealt with. In fact, the vast majority of questions will be dealt with in the risk assessment template that we develop, but you may have your own ones, and I'd invite groups to let us know if you come up with some question that's not covered in that template, to let us know about it so we can update the template ourselves. Someone asked about providing real examples throughout these presentations for the different procedures, all of the new procedures. And in fairness, there aren't too many new procedures. A lot of them are the same. The ratios are probably the biggest change for supervision. And the reason there aren't any real examples is because this is just really a brief introduction to all of the policies, and the real examples come out in the scenarios that are developed for the safeguarding training course that are provided by our volunteer trainers around the country. Someone also asked about misuse of drugs, specifically for Scouts and Ventures. Where's the policy? It's a policy that does need to be reviewed now, and it's going to be done over the next few months. But you can find it if you go onto the scouts.ie website and type safeguarding into the search bar. All of the policies for safeguarding come up, and drugs guidelines is there. It's probably about 5 or 6 down the list of the different policies, and we'll be reviewing that over the next couple of months. Someone also asked there for the registration for this webinar about the ratios for day activities and overnights outside the dens. They're still the same as they always have been. They're in the policy for camping and outdoor, or the guidelines for camping and outdoor, which is SID-YP06. And if you put that into the search bar in Scouts.ie website, you can download the PDF of that policy. If you remember, there's a table where it starts for beavers, and it gives you the numbers and then the number of leaders you need for every extra 4 beavers and so on. It's the same table as it always has been. The last set of questions that I promised I would deal with, and I just got some information today, just in relation to LGBT issues for Scouts, Ventures, obviously, so youth who are under 18 and their Scouters. So there's a new project team for inclusion, equality and inclusion. That's the reference for it, PSD-TOR-05. If you search for that or search for inclusion on the Scouts.ie website, that will come up as a list and explains what the team do. They're kind of just getting kicked off at the moment, and they're going to develop a new inclusion and equality policy, and there'll be email address available very soon, equality@scouts.ie, for people who have questions about LGBT issues. So I suppose the big issue for dealing with Scouts is Scouts or Ventures who maybe are transitioning or identify as a different gender, who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, is try to have that mixed gender leadership there so that the Scout can make the decision as to who they need to deal with. That's what's really important for our youth. Scouters is a different issue. If someone identifies as a particular gender, that's the gender they are. And it's a matter of talking to that Scout about it and how that's going to work in the group. What we do not want to do is exclude that Scouter from anything. We want to work with the Scouter to help them with the transition. And a case has come up in particular there with one group, and we already have people in Scouting who have transitioned from female to male and from male to female, and some of those people are available to help support with the safeguarding department in relation to that. It's just a case we were dealing with recently. There's also a document on scouts.ie called Supporting Trans and Non-Conforming Gender. It's a guideline document to help support people who identify as a different gender or as non-binary. And that was developed very recently with the help of people who have transitioned. So if you search supporting trans, it comes up in the search bar. It comes up as one of the first options in the list of results. It's a PDF document that can be downloaded, as is the terms of reference there, the PSD TOR 05. That's a PDF document that can be downloaded for the new project team that are working on equality and inclusion. Okay, so that's it. It's heading for 7:30. I do have another couple of workshops in mind. I already mentioned the risk assessment for groups, the safeguarding risk assessment. We're also going to plan a webinar for return to Scouting, to prepare members for return to Scouting, because there may be some fresh disclosures coming from children from things that have happened at home and so on, and we'll do a webinar in relation to that as well. But if there are other webinars or workshops you'd like the safeguarding department to provide, please email us. You can ring the main office there and you'll be put through to safeguarding, or email safeguarding@scouts.ie. So if there are particular subjects you'd like us to cover in the webinar, please let us know, because we'll be doing a lot of work throughout the year in relation to safeguarding on social media and in webinars, and we'd like to see what people would like us to cover in that. So please feel free to email into us with anything that you'd like us to cover. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for logging in to the 4 webinars. I hope you've got something out of it. I know there's some people who haven't got too much out of it because they might know an awful lot more about safeguarding than others. But I think from the feedback, there's a lot of people who have got something out of it. I hope that's true. If you think there's other things that we can do for you, please let us know. That's really important, because we want to help. We want to get out and meet the various groups. We'll do work for counties, provinces, and that to meet in smaller groups so that we can have a discussion rather than just me doing a presentation for half an hour and so on. So please get in touch with us if you think there's something we can do to help you. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all the best. Take care.